He married her to destroy her family. He never expected to fall in love with the woman he swore to ruin. By the time he realized what was happening to his heart, it was already too late to stop it, and too late to warn her. This is the story of Adrian Blackwell, and the wife he married for all the wrong reasons. Adrian Blackwell was 23 years old the night his father lost everything. He remembered the sound most of all, his mother's voice, thin and shaking, on the other end of a phone call he was never supposed to hear. He remembered the silence that followed. He remembered walking into his father's study and finding a man who had once commanded boardrooms sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing. They took it, his father said. Everything. The company his grandfather had built. The house on the hill. The name that used to open every door in the city. Gone, not in a fire, not in a flood, but in a single, quiet betrayal. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She had been his father's partner for 11 years. Trusted with the books, the contracts, the keys to every account that mattered. And when the company was at its most vulnerable, she had emptied it and vanished, leaving nothing behind but unpaid debts and a family that no longer recognized their own life. Adrian watched his father age a decade in a single year. He watched his mother sell the jewelry she'd worn on her wedding day, piece by piece, just to keep the lights on. He watched people who used to fight for an invitation to their parties cross the street to avoid them. And on the night his father died, thinner than Adrian had ever seen him, his hands too weak to hold a coffee cup, he gripped his son's wrist with whatever strength he had left and said the only thing that mattered anymore. Never trust the Hayes family. Adrian was 24 when he buried his father. He didn't cry at the funeral. He made a decision instead. 10 years is a long time to build an empire out of grief. By 34, Adrian Blackwell was no longer the son of a ruined man. He was a name that made rooms go quiet. Blackwell Holdings owned real estate across 3 continents, a controlling stake in 2 shipping conglomerates, and enough political leverage that senators returned his calls personally. Magazines called him ruthless. His competitors called him worse, usually after he'd already won. None of it was enough. Money hadn't buried the memory of his mother's hands, raw from selling everything she owned. Power hadn't erased the sound of his father's voice, cracked and furious and broken, warning him with his dying breath. Adrian had everything a man could want, and still, some nights, he sat alone in a penthouse that cost more than his father's entire company once had, and felt nothing but the old, familiar emptiness. Revenge was the only thing that had ever promised to fill it. So when his private investigator finally found her, not Eleanor Hayes herself, who had died 6 years earlier, quietly, in a small coastal town under a different name, but her daughter, something in Adrian went very still. Her name is Olivia, the investigator said, sliding a folder across the desk. 28. No idea about any of it. Works at a gallery downtown. Doesn't even use her mother's maiden name. Adrian opened the folder. The photograph inside showed a woman laughing at something outside the frame, dark hair caught mid-motion by the wind, a paint-stained apron still tied at her waist. She looked nothing like the cold, calculating figure he'd built in his mind for 10 years. She looked like someone's daughter. Someone's friend. Someone who had never hurt anyone in her life. It didn't matter. She was still a Hayes. And the Hayes family still owed him everything they had taken. Olivia Hayes had built a small, quiet life, and she loved every inch of it. She managed a gallery on the east side of the city, nothing glamorous, just white walls and good light and artists who needed someone to believe in them before anyone else would. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery that made her nervous about her savings account and deliriously happy every morning. She had 2 best friends, a plant she was somehow keeping alive, and a mother she barely remembered, who had died when Olivia was 22 after years of a strange, private sadness Olivia never fully understood. She didn't know her mother's name used to mean something different to a family called Blackwell. She didn't know a man like Adrian existed at all, not really, not as anything more than a tabloid name attached to a tabloid face. Until the night of the Whitmore Gallery's annual charity gala, when he walked directly toward her like he already knew exactly who she was. "I'm Adrian Blackwell," he said. Olivia had expected, she wasn't sure what. Arrogance, maybe. The practiced charm of a man who was used to being wanted. What she got instead was something quieter, more deliberate, a kind of stillness that made her curious despite herself. "I know who you are," she said. "Everyone in this room knows who you are. And yet you're the only one who hasn't come over to tell me how much you admire my last acquisition." She laughed before she could stop herself. "You look much more serious in photographs." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or the ghost of it. He recovered quickly. "I'm told that's a compliment." It wasn't, entirely. He smiled at that. A real one, unguarded for just a second before it disappeared again. Olivia didn't know it yet, but that smile, the accidental one, the one he hadn't planned, would end up being the most honest thing about their entire beginning. He was patient. That was the part Olivia never suspected. He didn't overwhelm her with wealth, though he could have. He didn't rush her, though every instinct in him wanted this finished quickly, wanted the Hayes name under his control before he had time to think too hard about what he was doing. Instead, he learned her. He noticed she took her coffee black but ordered it with cream when she was anxious, like she needed something to hold on to. He noticed she touched the corner of a painting before she ever spoke about it, like she was greeting an old friend. He sent flowers to the gallery, not roses, which she found predictable, but the strange, wild arrangements she'd once mentioned loving during a conversation he wasn't supposed to remember. She started to look forward to seeing his name light up her phone. He started to feel something twist uncomfortably in his chest every time it did. Within 4 months, Olivia had fallen in love with a man built entirely out of research and calculation, and Adrian had begun to lose track of where the performance ended and something dangerously real began. He proposed on a rooftop overlooking the harbor, on a night he'd chosen for its efficiency, press coverage, timing with a board vote, the optics of a Blackwell engagement steadying his stock price before a merger. He told himself all of that, right up until the moment Olivia said yes with tears in her eyes and her arms around his neck, and he felt something in his chest come loose that he didn't have a name for. The wedding was extravagant, photographed, exactly the spectacle his plan required. On their wedding night, Olivia looked up at him with a kind of wonder that made something in him ache. "I still can't believe you chose me," she whispered. Adrian smiled, the practiced one, the one he'd worn like armor for 10 years. "You have no idea why I chose you," he said. She laughed softly, certain he was joking. He wasn't. And for the first time since his father's funeral, some quiet, unfamiliar part of him wished that he was. For the first few months, the plan moved exactly as it should. Adrian quietly acquired properties connected, however distantly, to the Hayes name. He dismantled old business relationships that had survived Eleanor's disappearance, one careful legal maneuver at a time. Every move brought him closer to finishing what his father's death had started. But something else was happening at the same time, something he hadn't planned for and didn't know how to stop. When Olivia came down with a fever that kept her up 3 nights running, Adrian cancelled a board meeting, an actual board meeting, the kind he'd never once rearranged for anything, and sat beside her bed with a cool cloth in his hand until dawn. When a woman at a dinner party made a sharp comment about Olivia's modest little gallery job, Adrian's voice went cold in a way that made the entire table go silent, and he didn't stop until the woman had apologized twice. When Olivia cried one night, certain she'd embarrassed him in front of an important client, Adrian felt something inside his chest crack straight down the middle. He held her until she stopped shaking, and somewhere in the dark, he realized with something close to horror that he wasn't performing anymore. He was falling in love with her. Not the plan. Not the Hayes name. Her, the way she touched paintings like old friends, the way she laughed too loud at her own jokes, the way she made a life that cost nothing feel more valuable than everything he owned. For a man who had spent 10 years building a fortress around his heart, it was the single most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. And he had no idea that the walls were about to come down all at once, because on a quiet evening, while Adrian was still at the office telling himself he had time to figure out what to do, Olivia was home alone, standing in his study, staring down at a folder with her mother's name written across the front. She was standing in his study when he got home, holding a folder that was never supposed to leave the bottom drawer of his desk. Adrian saw her face before she said a single word, and he already knew that everything he had spent 10 years building was about to come apart in front of him. Olivia hadn't gone looking for anything. She'd only wanted to find a pen. Adrian was late again, some emergency call from the office, and she'd wandered into his study to find something to write a grocery list on. The bottom drawer had stuck, the way it always did, and when she pulled harder than she meant to, it slid open all at once, spilling a folder onto the floor. Her mother's name was written across the front in Adrian's handwriting. Eleanor Hayes. Olivia sat down slowly on the edge of his desk chair and opened it, and the room seemed to shrink around her with every page. There were financial records, statements from a company she'd never heard of, dated years before she was born. There were newspaper clippings, yellowed at the edges, with headlines about a Blackwell Holdings collapse and a missing partner. There was a photograph of her mother, younger than Olivia had ever seen her, standing beside a man who looked painfully like Adrian, except older, except sadder. And clipped to the very back, in a private investigator's neat handwriting, was her own name. Her address. Her gallery's opening hours. Her coffee order. Olivia's hand started shaking before she understood why. By the time Adrian's key turned in the front door, she was sitting perfectly still in his study, the folder open in her lap, and something in her chest had gone cold and quiet in a way it never had before. "You're home early," she said, without turning around. Adrian stopped in the doorway. He saw the folder before he saw her face, and for one long second, he considered lying. It would have been easy. He was good at it, good enough to have fooled her for nearly a year. He didn't. "Olivia. You married me because of my mother." Her voice was flat, almost calm, which somehow frightened him more than if she'd screamed. "You planned this. All of it. The gallery. The gala. Bumping into me that night, none of it was an accident, was it?" Adrian crossed the room slowly, like she was something that might shatter if he moved too fast. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't an accident." "Say it," she whispered. "I need you to actually say it." He sat down across from her, and for the first time in 10 years, Adrian Blackwell felt something close to fear. "Your mother destroyed my family," he said. "She emptied my father's company and disappeared. I watched him lose everything, the house, the business, his name. I watched my mother sell her wedding ring to keep us fed. He died still angry about it. His last words to me were a warning about your family." Olivia's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "So you married her daughter to get even?" "Yes. You made me fall in love with you." Her voice cracked on the word love, and Adrian felt it land somewhere in his chest like a blow. "You planned every date. Every gift. You knew exactly what to say to make me trust you completely, and it was never real. It started that way." He reached for her hand and she pulled it back before he could touch her. "Olivia, it started exactly like you think. But somewhere along the way, don't." Her voice broke completely now. "Don't you dare tell me you fell in love with me in the middle of destroying my life. It's the truth. It doesn't matter if it's true." She was standing now, the folder sliding off her lap onto the floor, pages scattering across the rug between them. "You still did it. You still looked at me the first night we met and saw a target. You still let me marry you without telling me any of this. The feelings you have now don't erase what you planned before them." Adrian had no answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. "Did you ever love me?" Olivia asked, and her voice had gone so quiet he almost missed it. Adrian stood and closed the distance between them before she could step away. At first, I wanted revenge. I told myself that was all I would ever want from you. His voice cracked, unfamiliar and raw. And now I would burn down everything I've built just to keep you in this room with me. For one fragile second, something in Olivia's face softened. Then she remembered the folder on the floor, her mother's name in his handwriting, the coffee order he'd used to make her believe in something that was never true from the start, and the softness disappeared. "You destroyed my trust," she said. "I know. You made me love you while you were planning to take away everything my family had left. I know." She reached down and slid off her wedding ring, and Adrian felt the room tilt around him. "I can't stay here," she whispered. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever." He didn't stop her. He wanted to. Every instinct in him screamed to block the door, to explain himself again, to fix this the way he fixed everything else in his life, with money and pressure and sheer force of will. But some new part of him, a part that hadn't existed before Olivia, understood that this was the one thing in his life he couldn't take by force. So he let her walk past him. He let the door close. And for the first time in 10 years, Adrian Blackwell sat alone in a room that no longer felt like a victory, and understood that revenge had never once made him feel this empty before. The days after Olivia left were the longest of Adrian's life that he cancelled every lawsuit connected to the Hayes family. He returned the properties he'd already taken, quietly, without press releases or headlines, because for the first time, he didn't want anyone to admire what he was doing. He simply wanted to undo it. His board thought he'd lost his mind. His lawyers argued for hours against dismantling a decade of careful strategy in a matter of weeks. Adrian sat through every meeting in silence and signed every paper anyway. None of it brought her back. He didn't call her. He didn't show up outside her apartment, though he drove past it more nights than he wanted to admit. He remembered her final words to him, not spoken, but written weeks later, in a letter that arrived at his penthouse with no return address. "You once married me because you wanted to destroy my family. I left because I couldn't live inside your revenge." He read every line twice, his hands unsteady in a way they had never been during any business collapse, any hostile takeover, any moment of his carefully armored life. "But I also know that the man who stayed beside me when I was sick wasn't pretending. The man who defended me at that dinner wasn't pretending. Somewhere along the way, you became someone different." At the very bottom of the page, one final line waited for him. "If you really love me, don't chase me. Become the man you should have been before you ever met me." Adrian sat with that letter until the sun came up, and for the first time since his father's funeral, he understood that revenge had cost him something he could never rebuild with money. It had cost him the only thing he'd ever wanted more than winning. Adrian Blackwell had spent 10 years learning how to win. It took losing Olivia to teach him something that money never could, that some things cannot be won at all. They can only be earned, slowly, without any guarantee that the effort will ever be enough. This is how he learned that lesson. And this is what he chose to do with it. For months, Adrian did something he had never done before in his entire life. He waited. He didn't send flowers to Olivia's gallery. He didn't call her friends, or track her movements, or use a single resource from his empire to find a way back into her life. Every instinct in him screamed to fix this the way he fixed everything, with pressure, with control, with the sheer force of will that had rebuilt his family's fortune out of nothing. Instead, he sat with the discomfort of not knowing. He cancelled the rest of the lawsuits against the Hayes family's old associates. He quietly funded scholarships in Eleanor Hayes's name at the art school Olivia had once mentioned, not as an apology she would ever see, but because it felt like the right thing to do, and for once in his life, Adrian wanted to do something simply because it was right. He went to therapy, which his younger self would have laughed at. He sat in a small office once a week and talked about his father's voice, cracked and dying, warning him about a family that had already suffered enough. He talked about 10 years spent chasing a feeling that revenge had never actually given him. Slowly, carefully, he began to understand the difference between a man who wanted to possess something and a man who was capable of loving it. Olivia rebuilt her life in the quiet way she'd always known how to. She threw herself into the gallery, staying late most nights, letting the work fill the space where trust used to be. Her friends worried about her, gently, the way friends do, and she let them worry because she didn't have the energy to convince them she was fine. She wasn't, not for a long time. She thought about her mother more than she ever had before, a woman who had died carrying some private sadness Olivia never understood, a sadness that now, finally, made a terrible kind of sense. She wondered what Eleanor Hayes had been running from all those years. She wondered if her mother had ever tried to make things right, the way Adrian was apparently trying now, according to the quiet rumors that reached her through people who still spoke to Blackwell's staff. She heard about the returned properties. She heard about the dropped lawsuits. She heard, eventually, about the scholarship fund with her mother's name attached to it, and she sat alone in her apartment and cried for reasons she couldn't fully explain, grief, anger, something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness, though she wasn't ready to call it that yet. She didn't reach out. Not because she didn't want to. Because she needed to know, for herself, whether the man who had done these things was real, or whether it was simply the most convincing performance Adrian Blackwell had ever given. 9 months after she walked out of his study, Olivia stayed late at the gallery, locking up alone under a streetlight that flickered every few seconds. Adrian was standing across the street. He didn't cross toward her. He didn't call out her name. He simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, waiting to see if she would notice him at all, and if she did, waiting to see if she would walk away. She didn't. She crossed the street instead, slowly, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't let herself feel in months. "I won't ask you to forgive me," Adrian said quietly, before she could speak. "I know I don't get to ask for that." Olivia said nothing, so he continued. "I won't ask you to come back, either. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you meant. Loving someone doesn't mean owning them. It doesn't mean deciding their life before they've had the chance to choose it themselves." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "And the revenge?" she asked. "Do you still want it?" Adrian shook his head, and for the first time, his smile held none of the armor she remembered from the night they'd met. "Revenge gave me everything except the one thing I actually wanted," he said. "It never once made me happy. You did. Even when I didn't deserve to feel that way." Olivia took a slow breath, steadying herself against 9 months of grief and anger and the small, stubborn hope she'd never quite managed to kill. "What do you want now?" she asked. "You," Adrian said simply. "Just you. Nothing else." She shook her head slowly. "No. You want another chance." He nodded, because she was right, and because for the first time in his life, he had learned not to argue with the truth simply because it was inconvenient. "Yes," he admitted. "That's what I want." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, the man who had once seen her as a target, and the man standing in front of her now, who had spent 9 months quietly becoming someone worth looking at twice. "Then earn it," she said. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no, either. It was something better than both, a door left open, not because she owed him anything, but because some part of her recognized that people can change, if they're willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of actually changing. Adrian smiled, and for the first time in 10 years, it wasn't the practiced smile he'd worn like armor through every boardroom and every gala. It was the same unguarded smile that had slipped out by accident the night they met, the one honest thing about their entire beginning. He had married Olivia Hayes to destroy her family. Somewhere between revenge and regret, she had become the only person he was willing to change for. And this time, walking beside her into whatever came next, Adrian didn't want to own her heart the way he'd once wanted to own everything else in his life. He wanted to deserve it. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: the people who hurt us don't always stay who they were. And the people who love us don't always earn that love overnight. Real change isn't a single moment of realization. It's showing up, quietly and consistently, long after anyone is still watching to see if you will. If this story moved you, stay close for the next one. There's always another beginning waiting on the other side of an ending.